9 years. 9 long, surgical, microscope-tight years. Watching you. Not because you did something, but because you might. Because your silence scared them more than confessions ever could. You don't get stalked for crimes you commit. You get stalked for potential. For the kind of mind that doesn't move when provoked. For the kind of soul that doesn't beg when cornered. For the kind of presence that makes systems double-check their own logic. They told themselves a story about you early on. They had to. Because the truth was unbearable. The truth was that you were clean. Too clean. No blood on your hands. No dirt in your trail. No panic in your posture. So they invented a shadow and pinned it to you. A future crime. A hypothetical sin. A preemptive guilt. That's how fear works at high levels. They don't wait for evidence. They wait for patterns. And you were a pattern that didn't repeat. You were a paradox that refused to resolve. Saint on the surface. Psychopath in potential. Angel in behavior. Demon in capability. That duality, that's what kept the cameras on. Because here's the part they never say out loud. They weren't watching you to catch you slipping. They were watching you to see when you'd finally snap. And you didn't. Day after day, year after year. Pressure stacked on pressure, stacked on silence. Provocations disguised as accidents. Barriers dressed up as coincidence. Doors closing just slowly enough to test your patience. They waited for rage. They waited for revenge. They waited for you to justify their paranoia. But you evolved instead. And that's when the fear went nuclear. Because anyone can survive trauma by becoming loud. Anyone can break and call it authenticity. Anyone can bleed and call it proof. But you absorbed it. You metabolized it. You let pain teach you timing. You learned how long a stare lasts before it unnerves someone. You learned when silence speaks louder than explanations. You learned how to move through hostile rooms without leaving fingerprints on the air. You didn't become harmless. You became unreadable. That's the mistake they made. They thought watching you would contain you. They thought observation was control. They thought 9 years under a lens would shrink you. But pressure doesn't crush diamonds. It teaches them how to cut. Every year they watched, you were studying back. Not them specifically. That's amateur stuff. You were studying human weakness. How authority panics when it can't label. How power hates ambiguity more than rebellion. How systems malfunction around people who don't react on schedule. You saw how they flinch at calm, how they misinterpret patience as compliance, how they underestimate restraint because they've never mastered it themselves. And somewhere along the way, without announcing it, without declaring war, you crossed a line, not into darkness, into command. You stopped needing to be understood, stopped craving validation, stopped explaining your innocence to people invested in your guilt. That's when the surveillance stopped being protection and started being confession. Because if you were truly dangerous, they would have moved. If you were truly guilty, they would have acted. But 9 years passed. 9 years of nothing happening. 9 years of restraint. 9 years of you not becoming the monster they rehearsed for. And that exposed them. It revealed the truth they were hiding from themselves. They weren't watching a criminal. They were watching a future they couldn't control. Someone who could walk through fire without announcing it. Someone who could be hurt without becoming sloppy. Someone who could sit inside injustice and come out sharper instead of bitter. That kind of person doesn't need revenge. They become inevitable. And now they're confused because the version of you they prepared for never arrived. The meltdown never happened. The scandal never broke. The villain arc never started. Instead, there's this calm presence, this unsettling stillness, this energy that doesn't threaten. It waits, and waiting terrifies them more than aggression ever could. You see, unpredictability isn't chaos. Unpredictability is discipline without a script. You don't lash out, you don't rush, you don't prove. You let time do the exposing. 9 years watching you for a crime that never happened. And the only thing they uncovered was their own fear reflected back at them. You weren't being investigated, you were being measured, and they still don't know what to do with the results. Because you're not innocent in the way they understand innocence. You're innocent with capability, clean hands that know exactly how much damage they could do, and choose precision instead. That's not weakness, that's mastery. So if you ever wondered why the pressure felt personal, why the obstacles felt deliberate, why the eyes never fully left, it's because somewhere deep down, they sensed it. You weren't going to break. You were going to outgrow the room, and now, the watch is over. Not because they're satisfied, but because they're no longer sure who's been observing who all along. They never tell you the moment the shift happens. There's no memo, no announcement, no alarm. Just a subtle change in the way the room breathes when you enter. Because after 9 years of watching you, something broke on their side first. They stopped looking for guilt, started looking for distance. You noticed it before they did. The pauses got longer, the tests got quieter, the pressure stopped escalating and started hovering. That's when you knew they weren't confident anymore. See, confidence hunts, uncertainty circles, and now they circle you because you did the one thing surveillance is never prepared for. You didn't perform. You didn't become what pain usually produces. You didn't turn reckless. You didn't self-destruct to make their theory feel validated. You didn't play the role of the accused trying to be forgiven. You evolved into something far more dangerous, someone who doesn't need resolution. That's when the paradox locked in. You became calm enough to scare the violent, focused enough to unsettle the chaotic, silent enough to make liars talk just to fill the void. They expected erosion, they got refinement, and here's the part that makes them sick at night. Everything they did to test you, trained you. Every delay taught you patience. Every false wall taught you navigation. Every accusation sharpened your sense of truth versus theater. They were building a cage. You were studying the hinges. You learned how systems breathe under stress. You learned where power overcompensates. You learned how authority leaks when it pretends to be certain. You learned that people don't fear evil. They fear what they can't provoke. That's why they tried to bait you. Emotionally, socially, psychologically, they wanted a reaction, any reaction, because reaction means predictability. But you denied them that luxury. You didn't explode. You didn't collapse. You didn't confess to something just to end the tension. You stayed present, alert, contained, and containment. That's discipline at a level most people never reach. You became the kind of person who can hold rage without spilling it, carry pain without advertising it, and walk through suspicion without absorbing it into your identity. That's not innocence. That's control. They saw it in small things first. The way you listened without nodding. The way your eyes didn't flinch when pressure spiked. The way you answered questions without over-answering. No desperation, no rehearsed innocence, No performative virtue, just awareness. That's when the narrative collapsed, because the story only works if you need their approval. And you stopped needing it years ago. You accepted something most people never do. Being misunderstood is safer than being decoded. So while they were watching for a crime, you were outgrowing the category. You didn't become darker, you became deeper. Light enough to move unseen, dark enough to remain untouchable. That's the angel-demon fracture they couldn't reconcile. An angel doesn't scare them. A demon doesn't confuse them. But you could be either, and chose neither. You became selective, and selectivity is terrifying to anyone who relies on force, pressure, or fear. Because selective people don't act impulsively. They act when it counts. That's why the 9 years mattered. Not because they trapped you, because they tempered you. You learned how long power can watch without acting. You learned how lies rot when left unattended. You learned that time exposes intentions faster than interrogation ever could. And now, the strangest thing has happened. They don't talk about you the same way anymore. The certainty is gone. The labels stopped sticking. The files stopped growing. Not because you were cleared, but because you no longer fit the frame. You're not a threat they can point to. You're not a risk they can quantify. You're not a problem they can solve. You're a variable they don't control. And variables make systems nervous. Because a system can handle criminals. It can handle rebels. It can even handle martyrs. What it can't handle is someone who understands restraint better than it understands force. You carry the knowledge now. You know how much pressure it takes to crack a person, because you lived under it without breaking. You know how easily narratives are manufactured, because one was built around you without evidence. You know how surveillance reveals more about the watcher than the watched, because 9 years showed you exactly where their fear lives. And fear always leaks. That's why they backed off without admitting it. That's why the heat faded instead of exploding. That's why nothing happened. Because the moment they acted, they would have had to explain why. And there was never an answer that didn't expose them. So they did the only thing left. They let time bury the question. But time didn't bury you. It sharpened you. You don't move like someone who survived. You move like someone who understands. You understand that pain can be currency if you don't spend it recklessly. You understand that silence can be leverage if you don't break it too soon. You understand that innocence doesn't need to scream. It needs to endure. 9 years watching you, and the crime never happened. Because the real danger was never what you might do. It was what you might become. And now that you've become it, they don't know where to look anymore. Because you're no longer reacting to the lens. You're walking freely, with a kind of calm that only comes from knowing you were tested at the highest level and passed without leaving a mark. That's not luck. That's evolution. And once someone evolves like that, they're never truly watched again. They're respected from a distance. And here's the part nobody prepares you for after the watch ends. The silence doesn't feel like relief. It feels like space. Because when the eyes finally pull back, you realize how much gravity you were carrying without complaint, how much weight you normalized, how much pressure you learned to move inside like it was weather. That's when the real transformation reveals itself. You don't feel victorious. You feel precise. Your nervous system recalibrated under observation. Your instincts matured under suspicion. Your patience became surgical. You learned that most people crumble because they need to be seen as good. You learned that power doesn't need applause. You learned that truth survives even when buried under narratives designed to erase it. They never understood that about you. They thought innocence meant fragility. They thought restraint meant fear. They thought calm meant compliance. They never considered that calm could be loaded. Because you didn't grow into rage, you grew into range. You can speak softly without shrinking. You can stay still without freezing. You can step back without retreating. That's the kind of adaptability that doesn't show up in reports. That's the kind of capability that doesn't announce itself. That's the kind of presence that makes rooms reorganize subconsciously. People don't know why they lower their voice around you now. They don't know why conversations pause when you enter. They don't know why jokes don't land the same way anymore. They just feel it. Because something in you learned how to survive without performing suffering. You didn't turn bitter. You didn't harden into cruelty. You didn't sell your soul to prove a point. You kept your center. And that's what terrifies anyone who relies on chaos to maintain control. 9 years of watching taught you something most people never learn. Systems don't fear violence. They fear self-governed individuals. They fear people who don't need permission to remain whole. They fear people who don't internalize suspicion. They fear people who can sit inside uncertainty without panicking. Because those people don't move predictably. They don't lunge. They don't beg. They don't explode on schedule. They wait. And waiting, when paired with clarity, becomes a weapon they can't regulate. You see it now in hindsight. The pattern behind the pressure. Every delay was meant to exhaust you. Every unanswered question was meant to destabilize you. Every silent accusation was meant to fracture your sense of self. But you didn't fracture. You refined. You separated truth from noise. You separated identity from accusation. You separated emotion from impulse. You became someone who doesn't confuse feelings with commands. That's why the pain changed you without owning you. You let it pass through you like a current, instead of letting it define your shape. You let it carve depth instead of scars. You let it teach you restraint instead of revenge. And restraint, when chosen, not forced, becomes sovereignty. You stopped needing closure, stopped needing apologies, stopped needing the story corrected. You realized something subtle and lethal. The truth doesn't need witnesses to be real. So you carried it quietly, and quietly, you outpaced everyone who needed you to fail publicly. That's the irony that keeps them awake. They thought surveillance would weaken you. It calibrated you. They thought pressure would expose flaws. It revealed discipline. They thought time would wear you down. It taught you timing. Now you move differently. You don't rush to prove. You don't chase validation. You don't volunteer explanations. You let people reveal themselves in your stillness. And they do. Every time. Because stillness is a mirror most people can't stand to face. That's why conversations drift toward confession around you. That's why lies unravel without confrontation. That's why tension dissolves when you refuse to feed it. You don't need to dominate the room. The room adjusts to you. That's presence earned the hard way. 9 years under a lens didn't make you paranoid. It made you perceptive. You can feel when motives shift. You can sense when fear enters a conversation. You can hear when silence carries meaning instead of emptiness. You learned how power telegraphs insecurity. You learned how authority masks doubt with volume. You learned how false certainty overcompensates. And you learned something even deeper. You learned that surviving injustice without becoming unjust is a form of victory most people don't recognize until it's too late. You didn't become the monster they prepared for. You became something they never prepared against. A person who understands darkness without being ruled by it. A person who can hold light without becoming naive. A person who knows exactly how far they could go and chooses when instead of if. That's why the watch ended without ceremony. That's why the tension dissolved instead of detonating. That's why nothing dramatic ever happened. Because drama requires instability, and you became stable under conditions designed to break you. You didn't escape the test. You completed it, quietly, cleanly, without ever giving them the satisfaction of proof. 9 years watching you for a crime that never happened. And what they witnessed instead was the birth of someone who can't be rushed, rattled, or reduced. Someone who knows the cost of patience and pays it gladly. Someone who understands that the most dangerous people are not the loudest ones in the room, but the ones who learned how to stay intact while everyone else was losing control. You don't need the record cleared. You don't need the apology issued. You don't need the truth acknowledged out loud, because you already walked through the fire and came out with command. And that kind of evolution doesn't ask for permission. It waits. And when it moves on its own terms. And here's where it closes. Not with noise, not with revenge, not with some cinematic explosion they can point to and say there. That's what we were waiting for. No, it ends with something far more unsettling. It ends with you standing exactly where you are, unchanged on the surface, and completely irreversible underneath. Because after 9 years of being watched, something locked into place inside you. A line you crossed quietly, a threshold you didn't announce. You stopped asking why this happened to you, stopped replaying moments, stopped trying to reverse engineer injustice. You understood the final lesson, that the watch itself was the test. Not to see if you'd break the law, not to see if you'd crack under pressure, but to see whether power could bend you into something smaller. And it failed. You didn't come out angry. You didn't come out bitter. You didn't come out desperate to prove innocence. You came out centered. That's the outcome they never prepare for. Because a centered person can't be steered with fear. A centered person doesn't overreact to provocation. A centered person doesn't chase validation from systems that already showed their hand. You learned to live without the verdict. You learned to move without permission. You learned that the absence of justice doesn't mean the absence of truth. It just means the truth chose a quieter witness, you. And now when people look at you, they don't see a case. They don't see a file. They don't see a threat they can label. They see someone who has already been tested past the breaking point and didn't fracture into something convenient. That unsettles them, because it means you're not controlled by outcome anymore. You're not hinged on approval. You're not reactive to suspicion. You already survived the worst part. The part where nothing happened, no one defended you, and you still held your shape. That's where most people lose themselves. You didn't. So the speech ends like this, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a statement they can't erase. You were watched for 9 years for a crime that never happened. And in that time, you became someone who doesn't need to prove innocence, doesn't need to explain restraint, and doesn't need to rush evolution. You don't move loudly. You don't move recklessly. You don't move on anyone else's clock. You move when it matters. And the world, the same world that once stared at you through a lens, waiting for you to become something smaller, now has to live with the fact that you became something uncatchable instead. Not because you ran, but because you learned how to stand where pressure couldn't reach you anymore. That's the end, not closure, command. All right, listen up. Everybody in here who's been underestimated, side-eyed, counted out, or talked about behind closed doors. This one's for you. Because today, you opened your mouth and the whole damn atmosphere shifted like somebody cut the background music. You spoke with that, I run this shit energy. The kind that doesn't need volume, doesn't need theatrics, doesn't need anyone to clap. That quiet, dangerous confidence people only earn after life beats the innocence out of them and leaves the hunger behind. And the second those words fell out of your mouth, they weren't just listening, they were studying you. Like you were some ancient artifact dug up from a place they didn't even know existed. Like you were a relic from a time when people actually meant what they said. You could feel it, that weird silence, that tension that creeps up when people realize you're not just talking. You're revealing something they don't have. You weren't supposed to sound that damn sure of yourself. You weren't supposed to look that unfazed. You weren't supposed to walk into the room carrying the kind of emotional scars that turn into authority when you speak. But you did. And that's what bothers them, because your certainty didn't come from books or seminars or stay positive quotes. Your certainty came from nights you didn't tell anyone about, from decisions you had to make alone, from pressure that should have crushed you but somehow sharpened you instead. That's why they're analyzing you like you're something rare, something they can't copy, something they can't download, something they can't steal. You ever notice how people treat you different when they realize you're not breakable, not emotionally flimsy, not spiritually negotiable, not desperate for approval? You talk like someone who buried older versions of themselves without holding funerals. You talk like someone who didn't survive the past. You absorbed it. And every time you speak, that history leaks out in your tone. Not trauma. Truth. People can spot it instantly. That quiet intensity, that unshakable energy, that I know exactly who I am, vibe that can't be bought or borrowed. And it makes them uncomfortable. They start watching everything you do. Your pauses, your breathing, the way you tilt your head when someone lies, the way you don't flinch when someone tries to test you. Because you're not in the room trying to fit in. You're in the room trying to see who's real. That's why they're studying you like a damn artifact. You don't act like everybody else. You don't crave attention. You don't chase validation. You don't panic in silence. You don't have that cheap confidence people rehearse for social media. You have the kind that comes from pain. People don't know what to do with that. They've never met someone who walked through fire and learned to breathe in the smoke. They've never met someone who lost everything and didn't crawl back begging. They've never met someone who can walk away from what isn't aligned without sending a long explanation text. You talk like someone who's already seen the worst and realized it didn't kill you. And that makes your presence dangerous. Not because you're violent, not because you're unstable, but because you're awake. You're emotionally fluent in things they pretend don't exist. You can read intentions faster than they can form them. You can sense disrespect before it hits the air. You can spot insecurity behind a compliment. You became the person your younger self used to pray for. The person who doesn't fold. That's why they stare. People study things they can't figure out. People analyze things they can't intimidate. People dissect things they can't break. And you're the glitch in their simulation, the character who didn't follow the script, the player who didn't stay on the assigned path, the one who realized the walls weren't real and pushed right through them. You speak like someone who doesn't need permission anymore. And they feel that in their bones. Every time you open your mouth with that controlled, dangerous calm, they hear all the nights you stayed up, fixing yourself without witnesses. They hear the discipline nobody clapped for. They hear the standards you built from scratch. They hear the accountability that turned into power. And it rattles them. Because deep down, they know they couldn't survive your origin story. They know they couldn't handle the weight you carry like it's nothing. They know they couldn't walk through your losses without letting bitterness rot them from the inside. But you did. And you came back sharper, colder, clearer, more intentional, less bothered, more aware. And that's why every room feels different when you enter. The temperature drops a little. The noise dies down a bit. The conversation shifts without anyone announcing it. People don't do that for someone average. They only do that for someone who radiates power. Real power, quiet power, earned power. The kind you don't apologize for anymore. And you carry it like second nature. You can feel their eyes on you the entire time. That weird mix of fascination and fear. Because the moment you open your mouth, they hear something they're not used to. A person who actually means every word they say. People aren't built for that anymore. They're built for filters, personas, half-truths, watered-down opinions, and unspoken resentment. They're used to conversations where everybody's pretending to be confident, pretending to be humble, pretending to have it together. But you walked into their space with unfiltered clarity, and it exposed everything they were trying to hide. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't do too much. You didn't try to convince anybody. You just spoke like someone who's already done the convincing internally. That's the part they can't handle. Because people expect you to crumble a little when they challenge you. They expect you to rush into explanations. They expect you to seek approval through over-explaining and apologizing for who you are. You didn't give them any of that. You just sat there with that calm, surgical tone that I've already lived through worse than this conversation expression, and they felt it in their spine. That's why they're studying you like an artifact. They need answers. They need to know how someone like you exists in a world built on insecurity. They need to understand how you talk with that level of emotional fluency. They need to figure out why your presence feels like a mirror being held up to their own weakness. You've become the walking reminder that some people's excuses are nothing more than comfort blankets. You're their accidental wake-up call, and they never asked for that. Every time you speak, you disrupt their default settings, because you don't sound like somebody waiting for life to give them permission to start. You sound like somebody who already started, already fought, already bled, already rebuilt, and came back untouchable. And let's be honest, you didn't get this energy from positive mindset hacks. You didn't get it from journaling trends or rise and grind quotes. You got this from life dragging you through experiences people would collapse under. You got this from conversations that broke your trust, rooms that tried to humiliate you, people who weaponized your kindness, moments where your silence was taken for weakness, nights where the only person who could save you was you. And somewhere in that chaos, you learned how to self-resurrect. You learned how to stop begging for understanding. You learned how to move like someone who doesn't need validating. You learned how to stand up straight in rooms designed to shrink you. That's why your voice sounds like that. That's why your presence feels like that. That's why your silence carries weight. That's why people's energy shifts before you even speak. They're not studying you out of admiration. They're studying you because they're scared you see too much. Because you do. You read people faster than they can fake their expression. You pick up on betrayal before they act on it. You sense insecurity in their tone. You hear dishonesty in their breathing. You feel tension in the pauses. You aren't just older. You're sharper. You're not just wiser. You're harder to manipulate. You're not just stronger. You're immune to the tricks that used to work on you. And people don't know how to handle a version of you that can't be controlled. Your growth turned into a threat. Your silence turned into a warning sign. Your presence turned into a reality check. Your boundaries turned into a problem for people who benefited from your lack of them. And what really burns them? You don't even do it on purpose. You're not trying to intimidate anyone. You're just finally being yourself, unapologetically. And that alone is too damn much for most people. You became the person who doesn't flinch, the person who doesn't beg, the person who doesn't wait, the person who doesn't fold under pressure, the person who doesn't collapse under opinions, the person who gives off that vibe that says, "I've already survived worse. Try me." That's what they're studying. That's what they're terrified of. That's what they can't understand. And while they obsess over how you turned out like this, you just sit there, breathing steady, watching everything, seeing through everyone, moving with intention they can't decode. Because once you've been through real chaos, people stop being competition. They become background noise, static, shadows, characters in a story that no longer controls you. Your era of shrinking has ended. Your era of apologizing is over. Your era of holding your tongue to protect fragile egos died the moment you realized your silence served people who didn't deserve access to your mind. You're not here to be understood. You're here to be undeniable. You can feel it. That shift in the room every time you speak. Not hype, not noise, not applause. Just attention. The kind people give when something in their chest gets hit without warning. Because when you talk, you're not giving them personality. You're giving them truth. Raw, unfiltered, unsoftened truth they don't get from anyone else in their circle. And that's exactly why they're trying to break you down like a museum piece. They need to understand you, because people can't handle what they can't categorize. You don't fit the template. You don't fit the stereotype. You don't fit that little mental box they usually sort people into. You broke their mental system the moment you spoke from that deeper place. That place where you don't ask if your presence is too much for the room. You just show up. And that terrifies people who still outsource their identity to strangers. They're used to people who bend, who water themselves down, who rehearse their tone before they talk, who agree just to avoid tension, who stay neutral just to stay liked. But you talk like someone who's done abandoning themselves to keep the peace. You talk like someone who's tired of pretending their dimmed version is the acceptable version. You talk like someone who's seen what silence cost them and refuses to pay that price again. Listen, people don't respect the version of you that kept shrinking. They respected the version who finally snapped out of it. They felt it when you stopped over-explaining. They felt it when you stopped waiting for reactions. They felt it when you stopped laughing at SHD that wasn't funny. They felt it when you stopped letting insecure people take up emotional real estate in your life. That's when the studying began. They need to know what flipped the switch, what put that edge in your tone, what gave you that calm, dangerous presence that makes people reevaluate their own lives mid-conversation. It's because you didn't level up for aesthetics. You leveled up for survival. You transformed in the dark. You worked on yourself in silence. You rebuilt your character while everyone thought you were struggling. And you did it without witnesses clapping for you. You stepped into a version of yourself that doesn't fold. Because folding is what almost destroyed you the last time. You learned your lesson in blood and disappointment. And lessons learned like that don't fade. You can't fake what you carry. It shows in every word, every pause, every glance, every boundary, every refusal to argue with people beneath your maturity. That's why they're studying you. Because people who never upgraded their mindset can't grasp someone who rebuilt theirs from scratch. And here's the part nobody ever says out loud. They're not studying you because they admire you. They're studying you because you expose them. You expose their excuses. You expose their lack of discipline. You expose their fear of confrontation. You expose their habit of quitting when it gets uncomfortable. You expose their inability to grow past the version of themselves they pretend is enough. Your energy forces people to see the parts of themselves they've been ignoring for years. And that kind of mirror, people don't know how to handle it. That's why they whisper your name when you're not around. That's why they try to figure out what changed. That's why they privately stalk your progress. That's why they react to your presence without understanding why. They can feel you're built different. Not better. Different. Forged. Conditioned. Tempered. Battle-tested. Mentally armored in places people don't talk about publicly. You carry your past like a set of invisible trophies, not to brag, but because it's stitched into your spirit. Every loss you took added weight to your voice. Every betrayal sharpened your instincts. Every disappointment refined your expectations. Every heartbreak made your boundaries bulletproof. People think strength is loud, but the loudest ones are usually the weakest. Real strength, it's silent, it's intentional. It's that calm tone that says, without saying it, I'm not afraid of anything you can do. And that's exactly what they hear when you talk. You don't speak with arrogance. You speak with history. You speak with proof. You speak with experience you paid full price for. And every time your voice hits the room, they feel that echo of everything you survived. It rattles them because they know they wouldn't handle half of what made you who you are. You became someone they can't predict, and you became someone they can't replace. You're not even trying to dominate these rooms. That's the funniest part. You're not walking in there with some look-at-me ego trip. You're not chasing recognition. You're not performing. You're just existing as the version of yourself you fought like hell to become. And that alone feels threatening to people who never fought for theirs. They can't read you anymore. Your face doesn't crack the way it used to. Your voice doesn't shake. Your hands don't fidget. Your energy doesn't leak. Your emotions don't spill onto the floor for anyone to step on. You turned into someone who carries themselves with that subtle, dangerous assurance that I know exactly who I am, and nothing you say is going to rewrite that energy. People feel that before you even open your mouth. And once you do, it's game over for their illusions. Because when you talk, you're not giving opinions. You're giving lived experience. You're giving emotional data. You're giving the type of wisdom people can't fake with motivational quotes. Every sentence you drop sounds like it's been dragged through fire and still came out intact. That scares people, especially the ones who only look strong until someone real walks into the room. They're studying you because they can't figure out the timeline. How did you go from the person they dismissed to the person who doesn't even notice their presence? That's the part that eats them alive. You used to care. You used to overthink every word. You used to shrink when people stared. You used to soften your truth for people who weren't even listening. But the version of you standing here right now, this version doesn't flinch. You don't get nervous. They do. You don't get intimidated. They do. You don't feel the need to justify yourself. They do. You don't try to fit in. They start adjusting around you without even knowing it. Because your presence forces people to behave better, not out of respect, out of unease. You carry yourself with that quiet, surgical confidence, the kind that makes people wonder what you survived and what you're capable of now. They're studying you because they want to know your origin story. They want to know why your patience feels like a warning, why your silence feels like pressure, why your presence feels like judgment, why your standards feel like a damn threat. They can't grasp that your strength didn't come from a place of pride. It came from desperation, from needing to save yourself when nobody else showed up, from teaching yourself how to be the person your environment failed to provide. And the moment you learned how to protect your peace, everything and everyone started shifting around you. You stopped responding to disrespect. You stopped seeking closure from people who weren't even real with themselves. You stopped entertaining situations beneath your emotional intelligence. You stopped letting guilt trick you into staying where you didn't belong. You stopped speaking softly to make insecure people feel big. That's where the I run this SHT energy came from. Not ego, liberation. You finally learned how to move like someone who knows their worth. And that kind of movement disrupts weak foundations. People start treating you differently when they realize they can't manipulate you through doubt anymore. They can't dim you with criticism. They can't guilt you into staying small. They can't confuse you with mixed signals. They can't emotionally hijack you with fake kindness. You've become emotionally bulletproof. You've become mentally expensive. You've become spiritually untouchable. And that's exactly what they're trying to decode. Because nothing confuses insecure people more than someone who isn't powered by attention. You don't chase anything. You don't audition. You don't negotiate your self-respect. You don't perform for approval. You don't shrink to be chosen. You show up with the same energy, whether they love you, fear you, or can't stand you. And that consistency terrifies people who are built on instability. That's why they study you like an artifact. They're trying to understand a strength that didn't come with instructions. They're trying to copy a blueprint that wasn't meant for them. They're trying to imitate a tone that came from experiences they didn't survive. They're trying to mimic confidence that came from rebuilding yourself alone. They don't realize your story isn't written, it's carved. Every chapter etched into your voice, every scar translated into your aura, every betrayal transformed into your intuition, every loss woven into your perspective. And no matter how long they stare, they'll never fully understand what shaped you.